Imagine, if you will, the setting for this one. We really need to set the stage properly because the atmosphere here is almost a character in the story itself. It is a completely dark and stormy night.
And we really don't mean that as some kind of cliche opening line from a bad mystery novel either.
No, literally. We were looking at the historical record for June 9th, 1966. We were in Elmira, New York, and outside the window of this very modest apartment, the sky has just absolutely opened up. The notes from our source material describe a massive thunderstorm, actually a hailstorm.
Right, the worst storm the area had seen in something like 16 years.
Yeah, the worst in 16 years. And it's important to visualize this. If you know anything about the architecture of that time, or specifically this apartment, you know that Jane Roberts and her husband Rob had this aluminum patio roof.
Oh man, aluminum roofs and heavy hail do not mix. Not if you want peace and quiet.
Not at all. So, picture this. You are Jane Roberts. You're trying to conduct a very high-level trance session with a non-physical entity. You're trying to, unlock the secrets of the universe, focusing on the molecular structure of reality. And meanwhile, hail is absolutely hammering that aluminum roof.
It's just a deafening drum fire.
Exactly. Rob, who is dutifully taking the notes by hand because, this is 1966, can barely hear Jane speak, even though she is sitting maybe 3 feet away from him.
It sets a very specific, almost spooky atmosphere, doesn't it? You have the absolute chaos of the physical world, the storm, the noise, the hail just battering against the house.
Yeah.
And inside, in this tiny little bubble of concentration, they are trying to tune into something quiet, something entirely internal.
It creates this fascinating contrast. The external world is screaming for attention, but the internal world is where the real action is happening,
Right.
which is the perfect vibe for what we are doing today. So, welcome back to our deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are cracking open session 266 of the early sessions, book 6 of the Seth material.
And I gotta say, this is a truly fascinating entry. It is dense, it is funny, and it's profoundly disorienting in the absolute best way possible.
It really is. And before we get too deep into the spooky stuff, I need to make sure we mention that this deep dive will be distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes. We are here to learn, to explore, and to get our minds blown by the source material.
Absolutely. And we should also mention right up top that if you want to go to the source, which you definitely should, you need to check out the New Awareness Network. You can find the books at sethcenter.com/the early sessions.
Because we are just the tour guides here. The Seth material itself is the actual destination.
Precisely.
Now, looking at the outline for today, our mission statement is actually twofold. First, we are going to unpack a concept that Seth, the entity speaking through Jane Roberts, introduces regarding the basic nature of matter.
Right.
He explains why fake objects, like hallucinations or what they call spirit hands, are actually just as real, atomically speaking, as the chair you are sitting on right now.
Which is a heavy concept. It completely redefines what we mean by objective reality. It basically suggests that objectivity is just a consensus, not a fundamental truth.
It does. But the second part of our mission, oh man, I love this part. It is a case study that is honestly one of the funniest and most revealing moments in the entire Seth material. It involves a rifle, an eagle, and a moose that technically didn't exist.
Ah, yes, the famous moose incident.
The moose incident. I've been dying to talk about the moose. It sounds ridiculous, but this moose explains more about how your brain works, specifically how you lie to yourself, than a dozen psychology textbooks.
It really does. It's the perfect bridge between metaphysics and psychology. It shows the exact mechanism of denial happening in real time.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have this stormy night, the session spurs, and Rob has a burning question. He wants to go back to a session they did way back in 1964, session 11, I believe.
Correct.
Apparently, during that session, some spear hands seemed to materialize in the room.
Right, which is a classic seance trope. Floating hands, ectoplasm, phantom limbs appearing in the dark. It is the stuff of Victorian ghost stories. It's usually the part where the skeptic rolls their eyes and starts checking the room for hidden wires.
Exactly. But Rob isn't really interested in the spookiness or the woo-woo aspect of it. He wants the technical explanation. He asks Seth, point blank, what was that? Was that a ghost? Was that you?
And Seth's answer is probably not what ghost hunters want to hear.
No, it's not very Ghostbusters at all.
Seth is very pragmatic,
Yeah.
almost clinical about the mechanics of reality. He says essentially those weren't spirit hands. And they weren't me. He calls them secondary constructions.
Secondary constructions. That sounds like engineering talk, not mysticism. It sounds like something an architect would say.
It is, in a way. Seth says, and I quote, We were manipulating energy and forming it into pseudomatter.
Pseudomatter. I love that term. It sounds like something straight out of Star Trek. Captain, the sensors are detecting pseudomatter.
It does.
But we need to define this clearly for you listening at home. What does he actually mean by pseudomatter?
Well, to understand pseudomatter, we have to look at Seth's core thesis on what physical reality actually is. He tells Rob that all physical matter, this table, your microphone, that storm outside the window, exists first as an idea.
Okay, so thoughts become things. We hear that in New Age circles a lot. Manifest your reality, all that stuff.
It touches on that, but Seth takes it a massive step further into actual physics. He says the energy doesn't reside in the object itself. The energy resides in the idea of the object. He says, you create or construct all physical matter. What you see are your own constructions.
Okay, let me try to use an analogy here to make sure I'm grasping this. It's like a 3D printer.
Go on. I like where this is going.
Okay, so the physical plastic object that comes out of the printer, the cup or the toy or whatever, that is just the end result. It is inert plastic. It sits there. It doesn't do anything on its own. The real reality is the digital file, the code on the computer that told the printer what to do. The energy, the design, the truth of the object is in the software, not the plastic.
That is a surprisingly accurate analogy for material recorded all the way back in 1966. Yes. Seth is saying that the physical object is just the printout. The file, the mental image, or what he calls the electrical intensity, is the charged reality. And usually we all agree on the files. We all have the shared file for a table, so we all see a table.
We're all on a shared network.
Exactly. We are on a local area network of reality.
But then what is a spirit hand?
Yeah.
Or hallucination? Because if I see a pink elephant and you don't, clearly my printer is malfunctioning.
Or you are printing a custom job. A hallucination, or those spirit hands, is when you take that energy and you try to print it out, but you don't quite finish the job. Or you print it using a file that only you have access to. Seth calls it tuning in. He says reality exists as electrical intensities.
Like radio waves.
Exactly like radio waves. If you tune into the station perfectly, let's say 101.5 FM, you get a clear, crisp signal. You get a physical object that everyone else tuned to 101.5 can also see and touch. But if you tune in imperfectly, say to 101.7, or if you are using a private frequency that no one else is tuned into, you get a pseudo-physical object.
So a ghost hand is just a bad printout, or a private broadcast.
Essentially, yes. Seth says if you tune into that intensity imperfectly, you will have a pseudo-physical object. It may be obvious, for example, to some of your physical senses and not to others.
Which perfectly explains why you might see a ghost but not be able to touch it, or feel a cold spot but not see anything. You are only tuning in to part of the signal bandwidth.
Precisely. You are getting the audio but not the video, or the video but not the haptic feedback.
And here is where Seth just drops the hammer. He says there is no basic difference between a hallucination, a dream object, and a physical chair.
It is a radical, radical statement.
Wait, hold on, though. I have to push back on that. If I sit on a hallucinated chair, I fall on the floor. I look like an idiot. If I sit on a real chair, I don't. That feels like a very basic difference to me. One supports my weight, the other doesn't.
Seth would say the only difference is consensus and intensity. He says, in such cases, however definite atoms and molecules are utilized.
Even the hallucination uses atoms.
Yes. He insists that even a hallucination has a chemical and atomic structure. It just isn't locked into the shared camouflage system that we all agree on. It is a private construction, but it is built of the exact same fundamental stuff.
So it's like a private cloud versus the public internet.
Right. And Seth emphasizes that simply because you can't touch it doesn't mean it isn't there in an energetic sense. He says, data, valid data, which is not materialized as physical form at any given time, still exists as potential physical form.
That is wild. It implies that reality is just a democratic vote. We all vote that the chair is there, so it holds us up. If I vote for a chair and you don't, I fall right through it.
That is the reality of the unreal. The ghost hands Rob saw in 1964 were real energy, manipulated by Jane and Rob's own psychic environment, turned into temporary matter. They weren't visitors from the great beyond, they were projections from within.
It makes the world feel much more pliable. Like we were walking around in a lucid dream that we've just forgotten we're dreaming.
That is very close to Seth's actual teaching. He views physical life as a mass shared dream. And this leads us directly into the second part of the night, because if we construct reality based on our ideas, what happens when we have a bad idea or a bias?
Or a fearful one.
Exactly.
Yes. The storm is raging outside, the hail is pounding on the aluminum, and it is time for the practical application of all this theory. Envelope experiment number 59.
This is where the theory hits the road. The The premise is simple. Rob has put a small object inside a double-sealed envelope sandwiched between pieces of cardboard so you can't feel the shape. Jane, in a deep trance state, holds the envelope to her forehead and tries to describe what is inside.
It is a classic remote viewing or psychometry test.
Right. And remember, the noise is incredible. Rob can barely hear her speak, but Jane starts getting impressions. Now, let's reveal the object first, so you, listening at home, know what she should be seeing.
Okay, let's open the envelope for the audience. What's in it?
The object is a tag. Specifically, a tag from a rifle that Wade bought back in 1962.
A gun tag. Okay. What does it look like?
Visually, it is striking. It has red and black print. The face of the tag is coated in gold foil. And most importantly, right in the center, there's highly detailed line drawing of an eagle.
Okay. Gold tag, rifle, eagle. Got it. That seems pretty distinct. It's not a vague shape.
Not at all. Now, Jane is tuning in. She is in a trance. What does she see?
Well, looking at the transcript, she starts getting some static right away. She mentions mucilage.
Mucilage. Like industrial glue?
Yes, she senses glue.
This seems to be an associative error. Maybe the smell of the envelope glue or a memory of a person named Dr. Instream who they associated with glue.
She also gets an M sound. She says maybe much or munch.
Okay, M for mucilage. Not quite rifle.
Then she gets more visual. She says she sees two people, specifically a woman and a child, or maybe a shorter woman.
A woman and a child on a gun tag.
Yeah. She describes them as bending down, and she also senses a blue dress.
Okay, so let's recap the scorecard here. The target is a gun tag with a gold background, red and black text, and an eagle. Jane is seeing glue, a woman and child bending down, and a blue dress.
It sounds like a total miss.
It sounds like she is describing a completely different object. If I'm Rob, sitting there in the dark with the hail pounding, I am thinking, okay, maybe the storm is throwing off the signal. This is a bust. Let's pack it in.
But then they open the envelope.
They open the envelope. Jane comes out of her trance. She looks at the tag. She sees the eagle.
And this is the moment. This is the exact moment where reality just breaks.
Jane looks at this line drawing of an eagle wing spread, feathers detailed, and she says, "That's a moose."
I'm sorry, what?
She insists it is a moose.
She is looking at a bird with feathers and a beak. She is physically looking at it with her own two eyes open.
Eyes wide open, she sees the wings, and she says, "Those are stylized antlers."
A moose.
A moose. And she doesn't just say it in the moment as a slip of the tongue. Rob notes in the transcript that even days later, when the storm is gone and the lights are on, he shows it to her again. She still insists, "That looks like a moose to me."
Okay, I have to laugh because how? How does a psychic who just gave us a complex lecture on the molecular structure of hallucinations and pseudomatter look at a clear picture of an eagle and see a moose?
This is where Seth steps back in, and honestly, reading the transcript, you really get the sense that he finds this absolutely hilarious.
I bet he does. It is like a cosmic prank.
Seth calls it a case of fine subconscious distortion, beautifully executed.
Beautifully executed. He is actively admiring this sabotage.
He is, because it proves his exact point about how we create reality. Seth explains that this wasn't a failure of psychic ability. It was a massive success of the subconscious defense mechanism.
Why did she need a defense mechanism against a piece of paper?
Because of what the paper represented. It wasn't just paper, it was a tag for a gun.
And Jane.
Jane, or Rupert, as Seth calls her, has a deep, visceral hatred of guns. To her, a gun signifies purposeful destruction. It is an object of violence and death.
So her brain just panicked.
In a split second, as soon as her psychic senses touched the data of gun, her subconscious slammed the door. It said, "No, we are not seeing that. That is bad. That is scary. We are not allowing that file to print."
But she had to see something. She was in a trance, asking for visual data. You can't just see nothing when you're tuned in.
Exactly. The data was already coming in. The electrical intensity of the object was hitting her mind. So her subconscious had to scramble to rewrite the code before it hit her conscious mind. It had to change the file before it went to the 3D printer of her perception.
This is fascinating. It is like real-time censorship.
It is. It's a completely internal propaganda department.
So let's trace the edit. How do we get from an eagle on a gun to a woman and child? That feels like a massive leap.
Seth breaks it down beautifully. The subconscious wanted to replace the symbol of destruction, the gun, the eagle as a predator, with a symbol of creativity and safety.
Okay, that is the thematic switch. War to peace, predator and mother.
Right. But the subconscious is highly efficient. It had to use the shapes available in the data. It couldn't just invent a new picture from scratch. It had to morph what was already there. So it took the shape of the eagle's wings. The wings are curved, bending down on either side.
Right, the arc of the wingspan.
Her mind morphed those wings into the backs of two figures bending over.
Oh, wow. So the arc of the wing became the curve of a spine.
Exactly. She saw the geometry, but her brain labeled it women bending down instead of wings. It kept the basic shape, but completely changed the meaning.
That is incredibly clever. It is like when you look at clouds and see a face.
Hmm.
But she was doing it with hard data coming from an object?
It gets better. Remember the blue impression?
Yeah, she saw a blue dress.
Mhm.
The tag is gold and red.
Mm-hmm.
Where on earth did the blue come from?
Seth explains that Rob bought a typewriter at the exact same store where he bought the rifle.
Okay, so it is a location association.
The subconscious scanned the memory of that store. It found the gun, it said danger. So it looked right next to it in the memory banks and found the typewriter. Typewriters are safe. Typewriters are for writing books. Typewriters are creative tools.
And the typewriter was blue.
We can assume so, or there's a strong color association there. Seth says the blue was a reference to the typewriter, which was purchased at the same establishment when Rupert eagerly tried to substitute one test item for another.
It is like her brain was playing hot and cold. It touched the gun hot, ouch jumped to the typewriter, cool, safe, blue, and served that up to her conscious mind instead.
It is a masterful deflection. Don't look at the killing machine, look at the writing machine.
And then we have the moose, the piece de resistance.
The moose, that wasn't.
So Jane sensed an M sound during the trance.
Right. Seth suggests this was a loose connection, maybe to mucilage or much. But when she opened her eyes and actually saw the eagle, which she still subconsciously associated with the gun and violence, her conscious mind was frantically looking for an escape hatch. She needed that image to be anything but a predator.
She needed to be anything but an eagle.
Anything. She had the M sound floating around in her head. She looked at the wings. She tried to make them a woman and child, but visually, with her eyes open, that didn't hold up in the harsh light. So she looked at the wings again, curved, pointy, and her brain screamed,
Moose! Because a moose is just a big goofy herbivore.
a moose is safe. A moose doesn't represent purposeful destruction. It is nature, it is passive, it perfectly fits the safe criteria. It is a fine subconscious distortion.
And she stuck to it, even days later.
Stubbornly. Seth says, I have never seen a better example of stubborn subconscious distortion. He even notes that he tried to help her during the trance. He kept saying, these are shapes, trying to get her to see the geometry without the label, but he says, our friend will not see what he does not want to see.
That is the quote of the entire source text right there. Our friend will not see what he does not want to see.
It sounds funny when we talk about moose, but think about that sentence.
Yeah.
It is devastating.
And this brings us to the real so what of all this. Because it's easy to laugh at Jane Roberts for seeing a moose on a gun tag. It's a funny story. But Seth's overarching point is that we are all Jane.
Exactly.
We are all seeing moose. Mises.
Moose. We are all seeing moose when we are looking at eagles.
This moves way beyond simple confirmation bias, doesn't it? Usually when we talk about bias, we mean ignoring facts that don't fit our worldview. Like, I don't believe that news article because I don't like that newspaper.
Right. That is intellectual bias. What Seth is describing here is perceptual bias. He is suggesting that our beliefs literally alter the sensory data we receive before we even process it.
So let's make this practical for a second. If I walk into a room and I'm afraid of being judged, let's say I have bad social anxiety, I might literally see people frowning at me, even if their faces are completely neutral.
According to this mechanic, yes, your subconscious takes the raw energy, the electrical intensity of the person's face. But before you consciously perceive it, your fear creates a distortion. You print out a frown where there is none. You are creating a secondary construction of a frown.
That is terrifying.
It is empowering and terrifying. It means we are constantly editing our own movies in real time. We aren't just passively recording reality. We are post-processing it with heavy CGI based entirely on our fears and desires.
It explains so much about interpersonal conflict. You know, when a couple argues and one person says, you yelled at me, and the other says, I whispered. They might both be telling the truth of their own perception.
Exactly. One person tuned into the anger frequency and constructed a shout. The other person tuned into the calm frequency and constructed a whisper. They are living in two different pseudo-physical realities.
It makes me think of politics, too. Two people look at the exact same event and see completely different things. We usually think one of them is lying, but maybe they're both just seeing moose.
They are printing different files, and
Yeah.
because they are printing different files, they are living in different worlds.
Seth mentioned something interesting about the blue distortion again. He says the subconscious blocked the gun data because it was unpleasant.
Yes.
It makes me wonder how much of the world we simply erase because it makes us uncomfortable.
Seth hints at this constantly throughout the material. He calls the physical world camouflage. We agree on certain things, walls, floors, gravity, because we need a stable playground to exist in. But the details, the emotional context, that is highly individual. If you cannot handle the reality of something, you simply won't see it. You will see a moose.
It goes back to that spirit and discussion at the beginning. If a hallucination uses atoms and molecules just like a chair, then reality is really just about intensity. Jane's fear of the gun had a higher intensity than the visual reality of the ink on the paper, so the fear won. The moose won.
The moose one. And think about the implications for mass delusion or mass hysteria. If enough people share a fear or a desire, they can collectively tune in to a distorted reality. They can all agree they see the moose.
And suddenly, the moose is real.
For all intents and purposes, yes. If everyone runs from the moose is real, even if it's just a shadow.
This deep dive is really making me question my own eyes. I am looking at my coffee mug right now thinking, is this really a mug? Or is it a symbol of my desperate need for caffeine that I've just constructed?
That is the whole job of exploring these texts, to shake the foundations a little bit.
I want to circle back to something Seth said about the idea being the only real thing. He said, data, valid data, which is not materialized as physical form, at any given time still exists as potential physical form.
That is a crucial point to understand. Just because you didn't print the object doesn't mean the data isn't there. The gun was there. Jane just refused to print it. But the energy of the gun didn't vanish.
So where did it go?
It went into the distortion. It fueled the creation of the woman and child image. Energy cannot be destroyed. It just changes form. If you suppress a truth, that energy will pop up somewhere else as a moose.
That sounds like a psychological truth as much as a metaphysical one. If you suppress trauma, it comes out as a weird habit or a phobia or a physical tack.
Precisely. Seth is bridging physics and psychology. He is saying they are the exact same mechanic. The conservation of energy applies to your thoughts just as much as it applies to a steam engine.
So to bring this all back to ground level, or as close to ground level as we can realistically get with Seth, what is the takeaway for you listening today? We have the storm, the spirit hands, and the moose. What do we do with all this?
I think the main takeaway is to practice what I would call perceptual humility.
Perceptual humility. I really like that. Break that down for us.
When you are absolutely certain about what you are seeing or hearing, especially if it carries a strong emotional charge, you need to pause. Ask yourself, am I seeing the eagle, or am I painting a moose over it because I don't like what the eagle represents?
Am I seeing my boss as a monster because he is one, or because I have a file in my head that says authority equals danger?
Exactly. We need to realize that our subconscious is a very active, very stubborn editor. It is trying to protect us, just like Jane's subconscious was protecting her from the violence of the gun, but that protection comes at the very high cost of clarity.
And if we want to see reality, true reality, the electrical intensity behind the camouflage, we have to be willing to look at the things we don't like.
We have to be willing to see the gun. Only then can we understand it. You can't dismantle a gun if you refuse to admit it's a gun.
Man, I am never going to look at a moose the same way again.
I really don't think you should.
This has been a wild ride through a thunderstorm in 1966. If you want to dive deeper into this, and believe me, we are barely scratching the surface of what Seth talks about regarding the nature of the psyche, you need to go to the source.
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
Seth material is dense, but it is incredibly rewarding. It is not just about ghosts and psychic phenomena. It is a literal manual for how consciousness operates.
You can find these books, specifically the early sessions, over at sethcenter.com for the early sessions. They are published by the New Awareness Network.
And again, just a quick reminder that we are doing this for educational purposes. We want you to read the books. Let Seth blow your mind directly.
We are just the tour guides pointing out the scenic overlooks.
And the moose crossings.
And the moose crossings. Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a thought, a final, slightly chilling thought to mull over while you go about your day.
Lay it on us.
We talked about how Jane created a safe reality, the moose to hide from a dangerous reality, the gun. Seth says we do this all the time.
Yes.
So look around the room you are in right now. Look at your life. Look at your relationships. How much of what you call comfort or safety is actually just a hallucination you've constructed to avoid looking at something you fear?
That is the ultimate question.
Is the wall really there? Or are you just refusing to walk through the door?
Hailing indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep tuning in.
And try to tune in clearly.
We will see you in the next reality. Bye.